The thermometer nailed to Enoch Halverson's cabin wall read 14 degrees below zero, but inside his small log structure, condensation dripped from the ceiling as the interior held at 17 above. Outside, 3 trappers stood in the February wind, staring at the walls, covered in overlapping rows of deer, elk, and bear pelts, trying to understand how one man's strange obsession with animal hides had created the warmest cabin in the Montana wilderness. Before we go further, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if stories about forgotten frontier ingenuity move you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. The year was 1842. The Montana Territory stretched vast and largely unmapped, a wilderness of mountains, rivers, and valleys where beaver populations still thrived and men willing to risk everything could make a season's fortune trapping pelts for eastern markets. But the risks were substantial. Grizzly bears, harsh winters, accidents, and simple isolation killed trappers with brutal regularity. Most men who entered the mountains accepted these dangers as the price of freedom and profit. Enoch Halverson was different, though he would not have described himself that way. He had survived 5 winters in the mountains, trapping beaver and marten along the tributaries that fed the Yellowstone River. He was competent, methodical, and careful in ways that kept him alive where others failed. He was a Norwegian immigrant who had come west in 1837, leaving behind a fishing village on the coast where opportunities had dried up, along with the herring runs. The mountains offered something Norway could not: land, independence, and the possibility of building something entirely his own. His partner that winter was Axel Lundqvist, a Swedish trapper who had arrived in the territory 2 years before Enoch. They had met at a summer rendezvous in 1841 and decided to work together for the following season. Partnership made sense in the mountains. 2 men could cover more trap lines, defend against threats more effectively, and survive accidents that would kill a man working alone. They had established their camp in a valley where 2 creeks converged, surrounded by beaver ponds and far enough from established trails to avoid competition with other trappers. Their cabin was typical of the era. They had built it together in late September, working 4 long days to complete the structure before the first serious snow. The walls were horizontal logs, notched at the corners, and stacked to a height of 7 feet. They had chinked the gaps between logs with moss and mud, a mixture that dried hard but cracked with temperature changes. The door was simple planks held together with cross pieces and hung on leather hinges. 1 small window covered with oiled paper let in dim light. A stone and mud fireplace occupied one corner, its chimney rising through a roof made of bough and poles covered with bark and a layer of sod. The floor was packed earth. The entire structure measured 12 feet by 14 feet, just large enough for 2 men, their supplies, and the pelts they accumulated through the season. It was adequate shelter by mountain standards. The cabin kept out wind and most rain. The fireplace provided heat and a place to cook. They had built sleeping platforms raised off the ground, storage shelves along the walls, and a small table where they could work on equipment repairs or process their daily catch. Hundreds of trappers lived in similar cabins scattered across the Rocky Mountains. The structures served their purpose, which was survival rather than comfort. Axel left the cabin on the morning of February 9th to check their northern trap line, a route that followed a creek through dense pine forest approximately 3 miles from camp. The temperature stood at 5 degrees below zero, cold but manageable for an experienced trapper dressed in layers of wool and buckskin. Enoch stayed behind to process pelts from the previous day's catch, scraping flesh and fat from beaver hides and stretching them on willow frames to dry. The work was tedious but necessary. Improperly processed pelts lost value or rotted during transport to market. Axel should have returned by mid-afternoon. When darkness fell, and he had not appeared, Enoch felt the first edge of concern. Trappers sometimes stayed out overnight if weather changed, or if they found particularly productive areas worth extended attention. But Axel had taken minimal supplies, expecting to return the same day. Enoch kept the fire burning through the night, listening for sounds of approach. None came. At first light, Enoch followed Axel's trail north. The tracking was easy in the snow. He found where Axel had checked traps, reset several, and collected 2 beaver. The trail continued deeper into the forest, then turned back toward the cabin. Enoch followed it home, arriving at their structure in late morning. The door stood slightly ajar. Snow had drifted against the threshold. Inside, he found Axel on the floor near the fireplace. The fire had burned down to cold ashes. Axel's body was frozen solid, curled in a position that suggested he had been trying to stay warm. Enoch checked for any sign of injury or attack. There was none. Axel had simply frozen to death inside their cabin. The realization came slowly and with terrible clarity. Axel had returned to the cabin the previous day, probably feeling the onset of illness. He had built up the fire and tried to wait for Enoch's return. But the cabin, for all its shelter, could not hold enough heat. The wind had driven cold through every gap in the chinking, through the spaces around the door, through the cracks where logs had settled. The fire had burned, consuming wood and producing heat that escaped almost as quickly as it was generated. Axel, weakened by fever or exhaustion, had not been able to maintain his body. Temperature. The cold had simply taken him. Enoch spent that day in a state of mechanical motion. He wrapped Axel's body in blankets and took it outside. The ground was frozen too hard for burial, so he built a cairn of stones on a hillside overlooking the valley, placing Axel's body inside and covering it completely. He would return in spring to provide proper burial when the earth thawed. That night, sitting alone in the cabin with the fire roaring, Enoch felt the cold pressing against the walls. The flames heated the air immediately around the fireplace, but 3 feet away the temperature dropped noticeably. Along the walls, frost formed in patterns that traced the gaps between logs. The cabin provided shelter from wind and snow, but it could not provide warmth. That required something more. Spring came slowly to the Montana Territory in 1842. Enoch completed the trapping season alone, working his lines with mechanical efficiency but without enthusiasm. He had accumulated enough pelts for a decent profit, but the work felt hollow. Each evening he returned to the cabin and studied its construction with growing obsession. The structure that had seemed adequate now appeared fatally flawed. He began visiting other trappers' camps within a day's travel. Most men welcomed company and conversation during the isolated mountain existence. Enoch asked questions about their cabins, about cold nights, about how they stayed warm. The answers were consistent. Everyone struggled. Some cabins were worse than others, but all leaked heat. Trappers compensated by burning enormous amounts of wood, wearing heavy clothing indoors, and accepting that winter survival meant constant discomfort. He found an abandoned cabin 8 miles south of his location. The structure had been built 3 years earlier and deserted after one winter. Enoch spent an entire day examining it. The door hung crooked on broken hinges. Gaps between logs showed where chinking had fallen out. He could see daylight through spaces near the corners where the notched logs had settled unevenly. Standing inside, he felt wind moving through the structure even though the air outside was calm. The cabin was essentially a sieve. Back at his own structure, Enoch began experimenting. He stuffed additional moss into gaps between logs, packing it tightly and covering it with fresh mud. The improvement was minimal. He tried hanging blankets against interior walls, creating dead air space. This helped slightly, but blankets absorbed moisture and froze solid during extreme cold. He built a second interior wall using pine boughs leaned against the logs. The boughs provided marginal insulation but took up precious interior space and created fire hazards near the hearth. Nothing worked adequately. The fundamental problem remained. Log cabins, as traditionally constructed, could not retain heat effectively. The logs themselves provided some insulation, but the gaps between logs, the spaces around, doors and windows, and the natural settling of green wood created countless paths for heat to escape and cold to enter. During these experiments, Enoch noticed something interesting. He had beaver pelts stacked along one wall, waiting for transport to market. The wall behind those pelts stayed noticeably warmer and drier than other walls. He moved the stack and found the log surface behind it free of frost patterns that marked the rest of the interior. The pelts, thick and dense with fur and leather, had created a barrier. He began paying attention to how pelts behaved. When draped over furniture, they trapped warmth beneath them. When hung near the door, they reduced drafts. When left outside overnight, they shed water and remained dry while cloth absorbed moisture and froze. Fur repelled wind. Leather provided a tough, flexible barrier. Together, they created something remarkable, a material that insulated, shed weather, and could be shaped to fit irregular surfaces. The idea came slowly, building through observations made over weeks. What if the pelts were not trade goods, but building materials? Enoch left the mountains in June to sell his furs in St. Louis. The journey took 3 weeks by horseback. He sold his pelts for a fair price, enough to sustain him through the next year with money left over. But instead of spending it on whiskey and entertainment like most trappers, he spent his time in the city studying buildings. He examined brick warehouses, noting how multiple layers created strength. He watched carpenters working on a hotel expansion, paying attention to how they framed walls and installed windows. He returned to the territory in late July with supplies for the next season. Among his purchases were items other trappers would have considered wasteful: 40 pounds of iron nails, 6 iron brackets, 2 heavy hinges, a quantity of rendered bear fat he had purchased from a trading post, and detailed mental notes on construction techniques he had observed in St. Louis. By August he had resumed trapping, but his mind remained focused on the cabin problem. One morning, while processing deer hides from a hunt, he hung several pelts on the exterior cabin wall to dry in the sun. He forgot about them overnight. The next morning, he noticed something remarkable. Heavy dew covered the entire cabin exterior, but the section of wall beneath the hanging pelts was completely dry. The pelts had shed the moisture while somehow protecting the logs behind them. He began conducting methodical tests. He hung a single pelt against the wall and measured the temperature of the log surface behind it compared to bare logs. The covered section was noticeably warmer. He hung 2 pelts, one overlapping the other. The effect increased. He tried spacing pelts at different distances from the wall. When the pelts hung freely, creating an air gap of several inches, the insulating effect was most pronounced. The principle became clear through experimentation. The pelts themselves provided insulation through their thick fur and leather layers, but the air gap between pelts and wall created an even more effective barrier. Still air, trapped between 2 surfaces, resisted heat transfer. The fur side facing outward repelled wind and shed moisture. The leather side facing inward created a seal against the log surface. Together they formed a system far superior to anything Enoch had tried previously. He spent September testing variations. He hung pelts in vertical rows, horizontal rows, and overlapping patterns. He tried different animal hides: deer, elk, beaver, and bear. Elk and deer worked best because their size covered substantial area while remaining manageable for one man to handle. Bear pelts provided superior insulation but were heavy and harder to work with. He discovered that treating the leather side with rendered bear fat made the hides more weather-resistant and prevented them from stiffening in cold temperatures. By October, he had developed a clear plan. He would cover strategic sections of his cabin walls with pelts hung in 3 horizontal rows, aligned with the cabin's structural logs. Each row would overlap the one below it, creating layered barriers with trapped air spaces. The system would use materials he already possessed and solve the problem that had killed Axel. The cabin's log structure provided natural mounting points for Enoch's system. 4 horizontal logs ran across the wall face, one at ground level, partially buried by earth. 2 middle logs of equal length spanning the wall's main section, and 1 shorter log near the roof peak where the gable tapered. Enoch decided to hang pelts from the 3 upper logs, creating 3 distinct rows that would cover the wall from approximately 2 feet above ground to just below the roof line. He started with the bottom row in early October. He selected deer and elk hides that had been properly processed, scraped clean of flesh, and treated with bear fat. Each pelt measured approximately 4 feet in length and 3 feet in width. He positioned them with fur facing outward and used iron nails to attach the top edge of each hide to the second horizontal log. The pelts hung freely, their bottom edges reaching down to partially cover the lowest log. He spaced them so they slightly overlapped side to side, creating a continuous curtain of fur across the wall. The middle row went up next. These pelts attached to the third horizontal log and hung down to overlap the top portions of the first row by about 8 inches. This overlap was critical. It prevented wind and moisture from penetrating horizontally between rows while creating multiple air gaps. Each pelt in the middle row trapped air between itself and the wall, and the overlap created an additional air pocket where 2 rows met. The top row presented challenges because of the gable's taper. The mounting log was shorter, and the available wall space narrowed toward the roof peak. Enoch used smaller deer pelts and trimmed some to fit the triangular space. These attached to the top log and overlapped the middle row, completing the 3-tier system. The attachment method required careful execution. Enoch used his iron nails, driving them through the thick leather at the top edge of each pelt and into the log behind. He placed nails every 6 inches along each pelt's top edge, ensuring the hide could not tear free in high winds. The leather was tough enough that properly placed nails held securely without tearing. He positioned nails slightly downward so rain and snow would not collect in the holes and cause rot. Between pelts, where edges met side by side, Enoch created overlapping joints similar to wooden shingles. Each pelt overlapped its neighbor by 3 inches, and he nailed through both layers at these joints. This prevented gaps from opening between pelts when wind pushed against the wall. The vertical posts on either side of the pelt-covered section served as natural boundaries. Enoch wrapped the outermost pelts around these posts slightly, nailing them to the post sides. This sealed the edges and prevented wind from penetrating around the system's perimeter. By late October, 1 full wall wore its fur covering. The cabin looked strange, almost alive with its layered animal hides. Enoch had used approximately 15 pelts, 5 in the bottom row, 6 in the middle, and 4 in the top. He stepped back and examined his work, then waited for winter to test his theory. The first trapper to see Enoch's fur-covered cabin was Caspar Dietrich, a German immigrant who worked trap lines 15 miles west. He arrived in early November seeking to borrow gunpowder after a supply accident left him short. When he saw the pelts hanging on Enoch's wall, he stood silent for nearly a minute before speaking. "You have covered your cabin with trade goods," Caspar said finally, his English heavy with accent. "Why would you do this thing?" Enoch explained his reasoning: the air gaps, the insulation properties, the wind barrier. Caspar listened with an expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief to something approaching pity. He calculated aloud the value of 15 prime pelts. At market rates, Enoch had nailed approximately $60 worth of furs to his cabin wall. $60 represented half a season's profit for most trappers. "You could have sold those hides and bought a better cabin entirely," Caspar said. "You could have bought glass for windows, proper iron hinges, milled lumber from St. Louis. Instead, you hang them on logs like a madman decorating his jail." The story spread through the scattered trapping community faster than Enoch anticipated. Trappers traveled widely, and unusual news provided entertainment during long winter isolation. By December, men Enoch had never met knew about Halverson's Fur Fort. Some traveled out of their way to see it. Most reacted with mockery, thinly disguised as curiosity. "Heard you're so afraid of cold, you're wearing your profits," one trapper said, laughing as he examined the pelt-covered wall. Another suggested Enoch had gone mad with grief over losing his partner. A third calculated that if Enoch had sold the pelts and purchased better supplies, he could have bought enough firewood to last 3 winters. The criticism had practical foundation. Pelts were currency on the frontier. They represented months of dangerous work. Using them as building material seemed wasteful when they could be converted to money that bought tools, weapons, food, and other necessities. Most trappers lived season to season with minimal savings. The idea of permanently affixing valuable trade goods to a cabin wall struck them as fundamentally irrational. Caspar Dietrich became the innovation's most vocal critic. He told anyone who would listen that Enoch had lost his sense after Axel's death. He suggested the Norwegian was decorating a memorial rather than solving a practical problem. The nickname Halvorson's Folly began circulating, implying that grief had driven Enoch to foolish extravagance. Enoch endured the mockery in silence. He did not argue or defend his choices. He simply continued his work, checking trap lines, processing pelts, and maintaining his cabin. But he also began keeping careful records. He measured interior temperatures daily, noting exterior conditions. He tracked firewood consumption. He observed frost patterns on interior walls and documented where they formed and where they did not. The measurements told a clear story, but Enoch knew data alone would not convince men who had already decided he was foolish. He needed something more dramatic. He needed winter to prove him right. The winter of 1846 to 1847 came early and stayed late. Snow fell heavily in November, building to depths that made travel difficult. Temperatures dropped steadily through December, and by January the Montana Territory experienced cold that old-timers claimed they had not seen in 20 years. On the morning of January 15th, Enoch's thermometer read 28 degrees below zero. By evening, it had dropped to 32 below. Inside his cabin, Enoch maintained a modest fire in the hearth. He was not burning wood at the furious rate required in previous winters. The fire was steady but not roaring, consuming perhaps a third of the wood he would have needed before installing the pelt system. He checked his interior thermometer, a second instrument he had mounted on the wall opposite the fireplace. It read 17 degrees above zero. He did the calculation carefully. Exterior temperature 32 below. Interior temperature 17 above. The difference was 49 degrees. But the more important number was the interior temperature itself. 17 above was cold by comfortable standards, but it was survivable. A man could sleep under blankets at 17 above without risk of freezing. Water would not freeze solid. Food supplies would not turn to ice. Most importantly, a person weakened by illness or injury could survive the night. Enoch walked outside and examined the pelt-covered wall in the brutal cold. Ice crystals had formed on the outer fur layer, but the pelts themselves showed no signs of stiffening or damage. The overlapping rows moved slightly in the wind, but held firmly to their mounting points. He touched the exposed logs on the adjacent wall, then touched the section behind the bottom row of pelts. The difference was dramatic. The bare logs were so cold, they burned his bare hand on contact. The logs behind the pelts were cold, but not painfully so. The system was working exactly as he had theorized. The 3 rows of pelts created 3 separate air gaps. Cold air hit the outer pelt layer and was blocked. The small amount that penetrated was trapped in the first air gap and could not easily reach the second pelt layer. The same principle applied at each level. By the time cold reached the actual cabin wall, it had been filtered through 3 insulating barriers and 3 dead air spaces. Heat from inside the cabin faced the same barriers in reverse, making it difficult to escape. The wind was the other critical factor. On previous winter nights, wind had driven cold through every gap in the cabin's chinking. Now the pelts absorbed wind force before it reached the logs. The flexible hides moved with gusts rather than resisting them, dissipating energy. Wind could not penetrate the overlapping rows to reach the wall surface. Enoch returned inside and added a single log to his fire. The modest flame was enough. His cabin, the structure that other trappers called a folly, was holding 17 degrees above zero, while the wilderness outside tried to kill anything exposed to its conditions. 3 miles away, Lemuel Granger was not so fortunate. Lemuel Granger appeared at Enoch's cabin on the morning of January 16th, leading a horse that carried his wife Sarah and their young son Thomas. The boy was wrapped in every blanket the family owned. Sarah's face showed the grayish pallor of serious cold exposure. Lemuel himself looked exhausted, his beard thick with ice from frozen breath. "We need help," Lemuel said simply. "Our cabin could not hold warmth through the night. The fire burned all our wood, but the cold came through the walls faster than we could heat the air. Sarah and the boy are suffering." Enoch brought them inside immediately. The contrast was visible on their faces. Sarah began crying quietly, not from distress but from the relief of feeling genuine warmth. Thomas, who was perhaps 6 years old, fell asleep almost instantly on Enoch's sleeping platform, his small body finally able to relax after fighting cold all night. Lemuel stood near the fireplace, holding his hands toward the modest flames. He looked around the cabin's interior with an expression of confusion and dawning comprehension. "Your fire is small," he said. "We burned 3 times this much wood and could not get warm. How is your cabin so much warmer?" Enoch took him outside and showed him the pelt-covered wall. In daylight, the 3-tier system was clearly visible. The overlapping rows, the air gaps between pelts and logs, the way each layer created a separate barrier. Lemuel examined it closely, touching the pelts, feeling behind them to understand the spacing, studying the attachment points where iron nails held leather to wood. "The air between the pelts and the wall," Lemuel said slowly, working through the principle. "It cannot move, so it cannot carry heat away, and the pelts themselves stop wind from reaching the logs. 3 rows means 3 separate barriers." He stepped back and looked at the entire wall. "How much warmer is it inside?" "Last night, 32 below outside, 17 above inside. 49 degrees of difference, but the important number is staying above freezing with a small fire." Lemuel was silent for a long moment. "Caspar Dietrich told me you had wasted your pelts. He called this structure Halverson's folly. But you have solved something the rest of us accepted as unsolvable. We thought cold cabins were simply the cost of mountain life." Sarah and Thomas stayed in Enoch's cabin for 2 days, recovering their strength. During that time, Lemuel asked detailed questions about the system. How had Enoch prepared the pelts? What was the bear fat treatment? Why 3 rows instead of 1 thick layer? How were the nails positioned to prevent tearing? Enoch answered everything, showing Lemuel the techniques he had developed through experimentation. When the Granger family left, Lemuel's last words were direct. "I will build this on my own cabin, and I will tell every trapper I meet what you have done here. Men should know that staying warm does not require burning forests. It requires thinking differently about walls." Word traveled differently after the January cold snap. Trappers who had mocked Enoch's fur walls now asked questions instead of making jokes. Caspar Dietrich, who had coined the term Halverson's folly, visited in March and spent an entire afternoon examining the pelt system. He said nothing about his previous criticism, but he asked careful questions about attachment methods and air gap spacing. Enoch answered without mentioning the mockery. There was no purpose in holding grudges over survival knowledge. Obadiah Sloan became the second trapper to adopt the 3-tier design. He arrived at Enoch's cabin in April with specific questions about pelt preparation and weatherproofing treatments. Obadiah was an older man, perhaps 50 years old, who had trapped in the mountains for 15 seasons. He had lost 2 fingers to frostbite and had nearly frozen to death twice in standard cabins during his years in the territory. "I am too old to keep fighting winter with inadequate shelter," Obadiah said. "Show me how you built this system, and I will build it on my own walls before next snow." Enoch spent 3 days helping Obadiah install pelts on his cabin 8 miles north. They worked together, attaching hides to the horizontal logs, creating proper overlap patterns, ensuring the air gaps remained consistent. Obadiah's cabin was larger than Enoch's, requiring 22 pelts to cover 2 walls. The older trapper had accumulated enough hides over the winter to cover his structure without reducing his trade inventory significantly. By summer, 5 more trappers had adopted variations of the technique. Some covered only their north-facing walls where wind hit hardest. Others, like Lemuel Granger, covered all 4 walls completely. The specific implementations varied based on available materials and individual circumstances, but the core principle remained consistent. Multiple rows of pelts creating layered air gaps provided insulation far superior to standard log construction. The innovation spread organically through the trapping community's informal network. Men traveling between camps mentioned it in conversation. Trappers gathering at summer rendezvous discussed the technical details. No one promoted the system through formal channels because no formal channels existed in the wilderness. Good ideas simply moved from person to person, adopted by those who recognized their value and ignored by those who did not. Not every trapper built pelt-insulated cabins. Some still considered the technique wasteful. Others lacked enough pelts to cover their walls after selling their seasonal catch. A few simply rejected change, preferring traditional methods regardless of their limitations. But those who faced brutal cold in inadequate shelters increasingly chose to invest pelts in their survival rather than converting them entirely to money. Enoch continued trapping through 1849, but his focus had shifted. He refined his pelt treatment methods, experimented with different hanging patterns, and shared knowledge freely with anyone who asked. He never claimed credit for the innovation or tried to profit from teaching it. The technique existed to solve a problem. Others could use it or not as they chose. Enoch Halverson left the Montana Territory in the spring of 1851. The fur trade was collapsing under the combined weight of depleted beaver populations and changing fashion. Silk had replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying the market that had drawn thousands of men into the mountains. Trappers were leaving the wilderness, heading to Oregon, California, or back to the States. The era of the mountain man was ending. Enoch sold his remaining pelts and equipment, packed his few possessions, and rode west toward the Oregon Territory. He was 39 years old, unmarried, and looking for a different kind of life. He had saved money during his mountain years and had enough to purchase land and start over. He never returned to the Montana wilderness, but his innovation remained. Trappers who stayed in the mountains continued building and maintaining pelt-insulated cabins. Hunters moving into the territory discovered abandoned structures with rotting hides still hanging from log walls, and understood immediately what they were seeing. Some removed the old pelts and replaced them with fresh hides, extending the life of the technique into new generations. Early settlers building homesteads in isolated valleys adopted the 3-tier system when winter proved harsher than anticipated. The innovation spread beyond its original context. Prospectors working high-altitude claims used pelt insulation on rough cabins where warmth meant the difference between productive work and frozen misery. Army scouts stationed at remote outposts recommended the technique in reports sent back to fort commanders. Trading post operators built pelt-insulated storage structures to protect temperature-sensitive goods during winter months. No one called it the Halverson method or attached Enoch's name to the innovation. The technique simply became part of frontier building knowledge, one option among many that practical men employed when circumstances required superior insulation. This anonymity would have suited Enoch perfectly. He had never built the system for recognition. He had built it because Axel Lundquist froze to death in a cabin that could not hold warmth, and Enoch refused to accept that such deaths were inevitable. The physics of what Enoch discovered were simple but profound. Dead air spaces resist heat transfer more effectively than most solid materials. Multiple barriers create multiple resistance points. Flexible materials that move with wind dissipate force rather than transmitting it to rigid structures. These principles were not new to building science, but applying them using materials already available to mountain trappers was innovative. Enoch had recognized that pelts were not merely commodities, but also building materials with specific useful properties. By the 1860s, the original pelt-insulated cabins were deteriorating. Hides rotted, attachment points failed, and structures were abandoned as the frontier moved west. But the knowledge persisted in the minds of men who had seen the system work and understood why it worked. Some of those men built similar structures in new territories. Others shared the technique with sons or partners who carried it further. Enoch died in 1873 on a small farm in the Willamette Valley, 22 years after leaving the mountains. He left behind no written records of his innovation, no patents, no formal documentation. His legacy existed only in scattered log cabins where animal pelts still hung in 3 overlapping rows, keeping interior spaces warm while winter pressed against the walls outside.